Hello, friends, and welcome to Page Chewing, and welcome to the Friday Conversation, episode 122, I think. I should never read off. I should never try to guess the numbers, because I always get them wrong. But anyway, we're here today to talk about what we've been reading in June, wrap up the month. And Chris, will you start us off with an introduction?
I can. I'm going to swallow a bit of chocolate and a bit of ice cream there. We're fine. We're good. Good timing. My name's Chris Mullen from the Chronicle Chris YouTube channel, and plenty of other conversations with Steve and the other guest who I'll not spoil just in case people are like on tenterhooks, you know. But we just call this person the evil overlord now.
What, you changed the name from boss to evil overlord?
Yeah, it seems to suit you better.
I guess I can do both.
People will never see you coming.
That's true.
Oh, and I'm Varsha. This is the point where people leave. I run the YouTube channel Reading by the Rainy Mountain, and yeah, I participate in a lot of conversations with these guys here, and they're a lot of fun. Today's nice because I didn't have a deadline reading assignment to do.
No one's going to ask you if you finished the chapters. No one's going to, it's kind of nice. No pressure.
Hold on. Whoa, hold on, everybody. Just in case there's any confusion here, the person that sets the deadline in the first place is always Varsha. So, just making it sound like we even forced this on her. Let me just guarantee people that it's definitely the other way around, and she's the person that almost certainly doesn't do the reading assignment.
That's true.
But this month you've been very good,
and I feel all their pressure.
Yeah, you've been good this month, though, so I have to give credit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This month's been decent.
We had some pretty good books this month, I think, though. I think, I guess we'll start us off. Chris, what did you, you're a mid-bite in your McFlurry. So, Varsha, what did you read this month?
I think I finished a lot of books I had started in the previous month. I'm looking at books that I started and finished this month. I think Last and First Men by Olaf Stapledon, which was our SF Masterworks read for June, was it? Yeah. And I think I started and finished This Savage Song by V.E. Schwab, which I read on audiobook.
Oh, very good.
As well as The Man Who Was Thursday. That one was a nice surprise. I found it because I was looking for an audiobook, and when I don't know what to pick next, I go look up my favorite audiobook narrators and see if there's anything interesting by them. And this one was Simon Vance, and the name is interesting. It's called The Man Who Was Thursday, a nightmare. So I had to pick it up, and it was a nice surprise. I really enjoyed that book. I finished The Ferryman. Yeah, there's a few that I started in May that I finished this month. You didn't like The Ferryman?
No, I'm just, no? You have a long list.
Yeah.
How was The Ferryman?
Apparently I finished 9 books this month. Yeah. That's a pretty decent, but mostly because I finished a lot of stuff that I'd started in May.
Yeah. How was The Ferryman, Varsha? Because that's been staring at me when I go into the bookshop.
I really enjoyed it. I think so. I had a few complaints about it. The central thing that the whole story is woven around, I found it slightly unconvincing. But if you put that on the shelf, I think it's a brilliant story. Yeah.
Cool.
I liked it a lot. I'm glad to have read it. I have a few 1 stars. I think there's another one. Oh, in a book club far away also, I think I finished this month. I had started it in May. That was my only 1 star read. 1 or 2 stars. I don't remember what I rated it. I think I gave it 1.25 on Storygraph. Yeah, that's it. That's it.
It can't be it.
Well, okay. Children of Time. Yeah. I finished. I think half of it I read this month. That one was magnificent. And I know we're going to do book of the month later, but I have to think about which one. I still haven't decided. I have several options. Child of God also started and finished this month. That one was interesting. I can't say I liked it, but I've rated it 4 stars on Goodreads because there's just something about McCarthy's writing that refuses to be rated poorly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's it. That's pretty much. I finished The Rediscovery of Man on June 1st, so that I'm not going to count that as June. White Luck Warrior. We finished the White Luck. That's the one Steve was waiting for. That was also about half through June, I think. Yeah, that one was also pretty darned impressive. I think with this series, the Second Apocalypse, so far, I feel like it's really coming to a culmination in The Great Ordeal. So while I really enjoyed the books so far, or appreciated, I don't know if enjoyed is the right word for such a dark series, but while I really appreciated the series so far, with The Great Ordeal, I'm like looking forward to what happens next and where we are going. Like there's a sense of general direction. Like everyone is at towards the end point of where they need to be, and so like trying to figure out how this will get resolved and like looking forward to that, I think is like, yeah, so the setup work done so far while still being interesting, I think is pretty brilliant. Baker's done something pretty marvelous here.
So what would you say to people who read the first couple of books or even the first trilogy and just decided it's too much? Like, would you recommend that they keep going, or what would you say to those people who thought it was just too much violence or darkness?
It depends on what they think there was too much of, right? There are certain things that, so I don't know why, but for me, maybe it's part of the fact that I don't really like have a moving picture in my head when I read. Like I don't tend to like really visualize. So a lot of the gore and like whatever grossness, it's just like words on the page that I'm processing and like figuring out almost like at a distance. So it depends, like depending on like what they find too much. I do feel like the second series is somewhat milder than the first, maybe because there's a lot less battle scenes. But yeah, I know people think the second series is darker, but so far I don't see it yet.
Interesting.
If you were to compare it to McCarthy, because obviously the last two McCarthy books that we've read, Blood Meridian and Child of God, would be seen as pretty dark and bleak and definitely gory in places. Like there definitely is stomach churning. How does it compare to that?
How does it compare to that? So I think, yeah, I was talking recently in one of the Second Apocalypse discussions about how this view of the world, like Baker's view of the world in the Second Apocalypse, feels very cynical. Like it does not show a better side of humanity. It shows basically all the ways in which we are hypocrites to other people or even to ourselves. Okay. And I think, and that part of it is pretty unrelenting. I don't know what this says about me, but I tend to agree with Baker a lot of times. And like I mean, but the sheer refusal to see the bright side, I think that does bother me. I think there is good that needs to be acknowledged alongside whatever it is he's complaining about. But and I think McCarthy is a bit similar in the last two books that we've read of his. With The Road, we talked about how the boy was sort of like this bright spot in the conscience and like trying to do good in such a terrible world. But in The Blood Meridian and Child of God, it's basically an unrelenting look at just how terrible people can be. In that sense, I think they are similar in that like it feels hopeless, like this is all we are, and like just this I don't think it's almost like I don't think we can do better. Like you just people are terrible, and that's it. Like, that's the end of that statement. It's not how do we get up from here and do better, or where do we find the goodness. And I think in that sense both are somewhat similar.
I sort of look at McCarthy, especially the three books that we've read. Obviously, Child of God and Blood Meridian are sort of set in the Wild West a little bit, so in the past, and the kind of lawlessness and kind of dog-eat-dog style of life that seemed to be about them, whereas The Road is obviously a dystopian future, and again, it sort of has this cynical view of how humanity will basically eat itself and in a way to survive itself, in that kind of way, like they'll not kind of look out for each other, community and stuff will not be a thing. So I think all of those are very interesting views of humanity, again, especially in a world that doesn't seem like it's quite there, but it seems like it's getting there, which is obviously bleak in its own right, and be able to find solace or enjoyment in these kind of books when everything else seems to be sinking along with it. I find quite strange for myself at the moment.
Yeah.
But enjoying them I am.
Yeah. I mean, it does. I feel like recently, I don't know if this is a product of growing older or if it's just that the world is at a place where I feel like this, but there are many, many, many societal things that I tend to feel angry or hopeless about on a daily basis. And I feel like these authors are addressing some of that. And yeah, and once again, it's when I'm angry / hopeless, I'm always like wishing to be able to do something about it. And these two authors at least are almost on the nope, there's nothing to be done front. So or I'm not sure if I'm reading that correctly, but that seems to be what I'm getting out of it at the moment. What do you think, Steve? How do you compare the two authors?
I can definitely see parallels, especially with Blood Meridian and kind of the themes and ideas behind something like Blood Meridian and the Second Apocalypse. So I can see some inspiration, but I don't think they're that close. We're just
right.
They do share. You can't see the influence, but I don't think they're that close. I think it's especially when I think McCarthy, I think mostly about his prose and his style of writing and kind of the ideas. But I think, without spoiling too much, I think the repetition, McCarthy kind of hammers it into you. I think Baker is more of, he tries to throw ideas out and tries to get you to think about things.
Okay.
And I think you can read it and and enjoy the Second Apocalypse and not dig into the philosophy and the characters and the themes and ideas. I think you almost have to dig into that with McCarthy. I think you have to really, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think you have to immerse yourself in it to really get the full impact. And I think with Baker, you can read it surface level, but I think there's so much more to explore. But you can read it. You can just go surface level. But McCarthy, you can't really do that. You have to, and mostly because the prose, you have to really be actively reading and immerse in it.
Yeah, those, especially Blood Meridian and Child of God, I think they're both books that I don't think I'd call entertaining at any stage. They're not books that you're starting and reading the story, and both have a story and an arc to them, but there's no real enjoyment to be had at it without the exploration of why you would want to write that book or why you would want to portray humanity in that way. I think it's only by doing that you get anything out of that book worth discussing, other than disgust itself.
And we were talking about this during the Child of God discussion, Chris, but for all the three McCarthy books that I've read, I found that it's like if I put the book down and lose the bookmark, I won't know where to pick up again because of the repetition and I guess and he uses that, I think, to great effect. Like whatever it is that he's trying to hammer home, I think that is done really well. And like the use of repetition is also interesting. I don't think I've quite seen that before. So it is definitely a style. And I think Baker doesn't repeat quite the same way. He doesn't repeat um, words or sequences of events, but he does, I feel like, repeat themes, or like there's always echoes of things going back to the first series, or like something that happened to a different character. You can find so many parallels and like repetitions of things that happen to other people that this character is experiencing. So I think in that sense, like I really like also this exchange between Baker and McCarthy. Like I know McCarthy is a stated influence of Baker's, right? So this conversation between the two authors, where it is an influence, but you have to like really dig to find what the influences are, or like what he is applying from what he's taking out of McCarthy. And like, of course, like I don't know for sure which bits he did, but it's fun to guess. And yeah, I think that interplay is really interesting too. I think at least the themes are similar between the two authors.
Especially the Judge and Blood. Without, I'm going to try to not spoil anything, but especially the Judge and Blood Meridian. Those who have read both, I think, can see the. I think that's the closest they get to kind of. You can see the Judge being a big influence on Baker.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's really interesting about it as well, because obviously McCarthy struggled for recognition through a lot of his career, but he eventually was a Pulitzer Prize winning author, and in the very later stages of his career, McCarthy release was big news. You know, lots of movies made of his things, and I wonder if the moniker of Baker being more broadly seen as a fantasy author actually does a disservice to the recognition of his work and the themes that it's trying to do, even without having read it, but having people speak about it and kind of the level of depth of philosophy that exists within it. You know, that those genre tags can really hurt people's ability to engage with work.
Yeah, I think it is a widespread like thought process amongst people who don't read genre fiction that there's nothing serious in what these books discuss, it seems like. And honestly, I think thinking about it recently, I've read a few contemporary fiction books. Pretty much every contemporary fiction book I've read, like in the last 3 or 4 months, I have rated poorly. And whereas even like the worst fantasy book that I picked up, like worst as in like per my liking, the fantasy book that I liked least, I have rated higher than the contemporary fictions I have picked up, because and I'm wondering if it's because of all the things that you have to do to put together a fantasy or sci-fi world, whether it is you have to have some depth to the world and the building of it. Like some themes I think just come with the aspect of building with the story. So it's almost impossible to do a fantasy or sci-fi story, I think, without some depth. Whereas you can tell a completely shallow and ridiculous contemporary fiction story where people are just horrible to each other, even though you're trying to write about friends who are apparently friends for life but are just horrible to each other, and like how were they ever friends in the first place. So I think genre fiction has a lot more to offer than I think people give it credit for. And I think this has been a long running conversation. Like, how do we get people to take fantasy and sci-fi seriously? Or even just like anything else. I bought a literary murder mystery called Death of a Bookseller that I think I think interesting things can be said through any story medium. It's foolish to just dismiss an entire set of books or authors just because they write in a certain genre that's for publication.
I think that's one of the reasons, actually, because I've been reading a lot more contemporary fiction, fic, etc., but that I really like translated fiction because it gives me something else apart from the story itself. It almost, as well as having a story of it gives me a window into somebody else's life. It gives you an empathic kind of connection with somebody else that isn't just the story standing or falling by itself. You know, it gives me a sense of place. It gives me a sense of culture. It gives me a sense of politics that maybe I don't recognize. And that in its own right as you kind of allude to about the genre fiction, gives it another in for me or something else that I can get out of it, which an awful lot of maybe contemporary literary fiction just stand or fall by the story that they're going to tell or how weak or how strong that is,
Yeah, that's a really interesting point about translated fiction. I think in some ways, stay with me here. In some ways, I think reading a translated fiction book is like reading a fantasy or sci-fi book, because you have to familiarize yourself with a part of the world that maybe you don't know too much about, maybe some terminology in the native language that like leaks its way in, or vice versa. Right? Reading fantasy fiction is maybe just like reading translated literature of that world if it's done well and immersive enough, I think. Anyway, that's it's interesting. I see the connection. That's an interesting point.
I had thought about myself, but it's just kind of talking through this kind of thing myself about why I seem to gravitate towards certain types of books, especially if you're looking for something that's within your wheelhouse or something that you're going to recognize, and it's something that you pick up and you know roughly what you're going to get or what you hope to get out of a book. I think that's an interesting place to recognize, or ground to furrow and say, I will like this because of whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
I think Chris, you mentioned about kind of the accessibility of someone like Baker or McCarthy. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I think it very much depends on the reader. I think if you are somebody that has come from reading, let's say popular works, things that as I deemed earlier on, are just deemed to be entertaining. I think you're going to struggle to get into McCarthy. I think you're going to struggle to get into Baker, even though I haven't really read him. But there are certain authors that require a level of engagement with the characters, with themes, with the philosophy that's going on there that a lot of people don't want out of books. Like, it's not a judgment call to say, oh, you must, like you're missing something. But a lot of people just come to reading or literature just for escapism or for something fluffy. Like my mum's classically just read the same book for 25, 30 years over and over again. Not actually the same novel, but there's a specific type of novel, a specific type of author that she wants. And if she finds it, somebody writes in similar style, they're like, oh, I'm going to like that. And will never step outside that and doesn't want to step outside that. In fact, if they ever do step outside it, they're like, oh, no, I don't like this. This isn't for me. Whereas I think there are different types of readers that are looking to stretch their understanding of themselves, of the world, of everything else around them by exploring through literature. And I think, without kind of being a bit highbrow about it, I think that's where a lot of our reads kind of sit a little bit, because it gives you something to talk about. It sort of prompts discussion and prompts something to talk about, rather than, oh, here's I'm going to be reductive about romance, but romance books tend to be a bit reductive of having some sort of setup or meet cute at the start and then it ending in a certain predictable way. And like I say, that is a very successful genre because it doesn't veer too much away from that. People get what they want out of it, and that's exactly what they want out of it. Whereas I don't know how much you could discuss about that from one book to the next that would be wildly different, other than your engagement with individual character archetypes or something,
Yeah, I think romance books have a very specific structure too, right? Like there's a term for like the third act conflict. You have to have one and have them in some kind of trouble before things get resolved and you get the happily ever after and whatnot. So yeah, that is interesting. I guess if they follow a specific structure and there's not much to really surprise you, even though I guess third act conflicts try.
Yeah, I think romance, and again, not to be insulting at all, everyone likes what they like and no judgment, but I think romance, because it does have a certain formula, I think it's like a comfort food, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think for people to know, kind of have an idea about what they're getting into and finding the right audience, because if someone's reading romantasy and they're like, I should try R. Scott Baker, and I think having an idea like that might be too much for me. I'm not going to waste my time. I'm going to keep reading what I know I like. Or I think having that barrier may be a good thing, because you want people to know kind of what they're getting into. And if you can't handle those kind of things, it's kind of like extreme horror movies or movies that are really like something like Martyrs. I mean, you want something like that to have a little bit of a reputation for being pretty heavy. Like, you don't want to go into it thinking, well, I'm going to sit in for a cozy night with this movie I found, this French movie called Martyrs. Like, I'm going to pop some popcorn. It's like, no, that's not the kind of DVD you're going to have. You're not going to have a good time. So I think it's a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing. It may turn potential readers off because they're afraid of giving it a shot.
But I think it means that certain things can exist that cross that boundary. So, like, the success of Game of Thrones basically takes what is very loosely a fantasy base to it. Like, I don't think there's, take the dragons out of Game of Thrones. I don't think there's an awful lot of fantasy left. It's basically medieval history at that stage. But the fact that people class it as a fantasy genre story with sex and murder and plot twists and all of that kind of stuff, the political intrigue that goes with it, does provide people with the idea of, I really enjoyed that. What else is there like that? And one of the real strengths of literature is that there is such a breadth of stories. Sometimes, say you like Martyrs, for instance. Martyrs is a good example. There are only so many other movies that do that, if that makes sense. Whereas literature, actually, you will find, whether traditionally published, independently published, self-published, or otherwise, you will find hundreds of books that fall into that kind of ilk, and be able to gravitate more to the stories that you would like to read, rather than just having to pick one or two good examples. And some of those, especially on a technical level on TV or movie, can be of different quality, and you may not like it because of a technical deficiency rather than necessarily anything to do with the story.
So, going back to your earlier question, Steve, about the whether you would recommend the second series, I wanted to tease that out a little bit more. Do you know what it is that people find to be too much about the first series? Like, have you seen a general list of complaints that makes people leave?
I think the biggest thing that I've seen and heard from people who've read the first book or first trilogy is that it's violence against women is understandably so, because it can be it's a lot. But that's mostly why I see people drop off, because I just can't handle this. I have a problem with how women are portrayed and how women are treated. And we've talked about this during the discussions about how that kind of takes a turn. I'm choosing my words really carefully here for the second series, but I think that changes quite a bit in that you do have an arc with certain characters of where they started and where they end up.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think if that's why they are leaving the first series, I think the second series does have more, like, at least more instances that I remember of the second series. So yeah, I think that doesn't change too much, at least so far. But for the few character arcs that you mentioned, so. But yeah, if there's, I think there's also complaints of, or at least like things that make it feel dark. I think the hopelessness and the weight of the world, that stuff, I think maybe gets deeper in the second series too. So
yeah.
So maybe I should take back what I said before. The second series is slightly dark. I think just on the face of it, it's so much easier to read and so much more familiar, I think, because it's practically Lord of the Rings, like a really dark and twisted Lord of the Rings. But yeah, but it does so many things differently. And yeah, I think you can get a lot from that series if you're able to look past that and think about what is being portrayed and why. I hope his reasoning for portraying women that way is not historical accuracy. I think he's trying to do something with that. So yeah, I'll see where he gets there, and then we can talk about that some more.
Yeah. I do think fantasy has a problem with sexual violence towards women as a whole. I think I had this conversation with somebody a few days ago. Actually, I just don't think it's good enough that it's so pervasive throughout the genre in the way that it currently is in modern storytelling. Especially when you contrast it to the sort of rise of romantasy on the other side. It's sort of like an answer and call to it in some ways, but its use of sexual violence, especially against women, in the aid of character progression is poor. I just say, we've talked about this a couple of times, I think, before. I just think it's too often used to replace other ways that you could write progression of characters, which I think, especially given a fantasy genre, you can literally do anything to have somebody. Radioactive spiders exist for a thing. It does not have to be an act of sexual violence. It can be done literally any way that you want, and I think, especially by male authors, to propagate that as a theme in your book. I think as time goes on and you look at the kind of how fantasy is battling for space on the shelf, like traditional fantasy is battling for space on shelves in bookstores, I think it's sort of eaten itself a little bit because of that barrier that's put up, because it is the kind of thing, whether you think it's justified or not, that a lot of people will get to that stage of a book and go, shut, back on the shelf. We're not going any further with that, and unless it's really earned or really thought out or justified in some other way, I think that's it's always going to be problematic.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I do not like violence in general, and particularly sexual violence, when it's used as a way to move the story forward. Like, if you're trying to explore something with that, then yeah, like, depending on the outcome of that, whether or not it's done well, we'll decide based on that. But at least if we can see the intent to be that of exploration and not to use it as a prop in the story, I think that is fine. Like, I still want to question why this is particularly what you want to explore, but yeah, when it's used as a prop, it's like, yeah, I don't understand it. And I think the answer I understand least for fantasy books is historical accuracy. Be quiet.
I think too often assault and sexual assault specifically is used as a tool to kind of propel the story forward. It was a way for someone to seek revenge, or to get someone to do something, to motivate someone to do something, or to. And I think there's ways to incorporate it, but it's a lot of it's done in a lazy way that is just, I'm going to insert this because this will motivate and move the story forward, instead of, like you said, Chris, using anything else. You can create anything you want to create, but I think it's a lazy way to move the story forward. And it's just, yeah, I think one book that while you were both talking, I was thinking about a book, kind of give an example of something that, like a romance type of book with lots of death and characters dying, and that's Truth of Crowns. Our friend Carl D. Albert wrote, and I don't remember any sexual. Lots of people die and get named, and I mean, don't get me wrong. There's lots of things happen, but it's a lot of things happen, but it's done in a way that isn't done lazily, to where it's just the same things to motivate your characters. It's a lot of the things just kind of break your heart. Like, another thing I wish a lot of more fantasy authors would do, and I hate to get on my soapbox, but like male authors especially, if you're going to write a sex scene, have someone else read it for you, please. Because sometimes I'm sure we can rattle off a bunch of books that we can talk about a love scene, or, you know, a sexual scene that's supposed to be, you know, like, supposed to mean something, it's supposed to have emotion behind it, and it's just not good. So
yeah, if
you're going to do that, have someone read it, have someone look it over for you first. Make sure it doesn't sound like you're writing for, you know, an article on a you know, website or a magazine, please. Like, there's ways to do it, and just, you know, just be careful, you know, like, treat those situations with care. Like, take the extra step, have a sensitivity reader read over it, or have several other readers read over it and give you feedback before you hit publish.
Yeah, I've two thoughts really about it. One is just a general criticism, which is that they use sexual violence or sexual assault as a way to give a female character superpowers. Like that's honestly, that you portray sexual violence as a means for good is I just think bang out of order. I just don't think you're progressing in reality. But aside from just saying that, I wonder how much the presence of sex as a titillating tool in Game of Thrones give rise to this being the most successful book in the genre for a while. That people were like trying to copy the archetype of that. And what I will say about it is, I actually find the use of Daenerys and the sexual assault that happens there to be, when I first read it, it was a lot bigger in my head than what it was when I reread it. You know what I mean? I thought it went on for chapters upon chapters, and what it actually did, and it wasn't so. I don't know. It's portrayed differently than I think a lot of other people do it now. I think he uses it in a different way. Not necessarily whether it's good or bad, because that's in the reader. And certainly, like say, on my first read, I thought it was a bit much. But you know, I can look at it in a different way. But I wonder how much that gave rise to this whole, that it has to be in all fantasy books now, especially modern fantasy books, especially grimdark books, are things that pervade to be in that world as a necessary element, a tick box that you have to have.
Yeah.
Got a bit heavy for a Saturday night, didn't it?
It is, yes. No, and I think it's
fun wrap.
I think it's something that certain, you know, I think it's important to talk about, though, you know, because don't be lazy. Don't use it because it's kind of the formula. Like, if you're going to use it, then make it mean something. Don't just use it as a lazy way to propel the story forward.
Move the story forward, create a random shock, some twist.
And really, it pisses me off too, because a lot of grim, and I love the subgenre of grimdark, as everyone knows, and it bothers me because a lot of people trash the genre, and they say that it's like I can't defend it because it's true. Like, a lot of authors use that, so it really bothers me. Like, if you're gonna do it, then don't. Come on.
Yeah. You know. I just think there's better ways to do it. I think you can be creative and write the character motivations in a much better way than just kind of being reductive about it being from a singular event that in effect destroys lives rather than rebuilds them. Like, that's just the fact and the truth of that in the real world, I suppose, so to speak. I know you're kind of talking of fantasy worlds, but I think grimdark would purport to be more realistic fantasy in some ways, and I think it does the opposite when you do it. So,
yeah, hard
to transition. But Chris, what did you read?
What did I read? So I have a lot of weird and wonderful stuff. I will tell, like Varsha, there was a lot of books started last month that I ended up reading this month, including Rediscovery of Man. I have to mention Rediscovery of Man because it's been a month since I've read it now. That is one of the wildest books I have ever read in my entire life. I can say that kind of unqualified now. It is a collection of 12, 13 short stories that seemingly have no connection and yet somehow are completely interconnected in ways that I don't think you realize until you're about two stories from the end, and you're like, that's the same idea that he had in that stupid story about the cats. But a story about cats, you know, with stories about dragons, with stories about people losing memories, with stories about absolutely everything, and none of it just seems like, honestly, an author just took a crap load of drugs and just that night wrote down a story, and that's what came out, and he published it in short fiction of some sort. But in a weird and wonderful way, it's somebody that over a period of 10, 15 years wrote these stories that were sort of interconnected in this single world, and that I'm sure if you were a fan at the time and you seen a new story come out by Cordwainer Smith, if you got it, you were probably all in going, okay, give me a little bit more of this. And I definitely come down on the side of, it's weird reading it in singular. Like, we've one of the the short stories coming up as part of the short stories for respective speculations. I'd be fascinated to see what you think of it, Steve, because they're almost nonsensical. That's the bit that I would say. So it's one of those things that you could read and just kind of go like, what is this? I'm stopping reading this. It's bizarre, but I just found it by the end, this incredible exploration of how we treat people and how we treat people as underlings and a lot of the bigger cultural things in society. And from somebody, I think Jared's review of it, where he ties it together, the fact that he was a psychologist and actually kind of pulled it all together. I thought it was a really great review about how he pulled it all together. It was terrific. What was a lot more lighthearted but equally fun was Convenience Store Woman by Saka Murata. Have you read that, Varsha? You have, haven't you? Or?
Oh, yes, I have. Yes, I have. The Convenience Store Woman. Yeah. I have, yeah. That was a very interesting book. I don't remember a lot, but I think I kind of enjoyed being in her head and like trying to figure out what the heck is going on with her and what is this life she is leading. Is this but yeah, it is different. And to your point about translated literature before, I think trying to understand things about this culture that is completely foreign to me and how things work here, what are the societal and societal dynamics, like relationship dynamics between like parents and siblings. I think that story does explore a lot of that. And I don't know if you felt this, Chris, but I think a lot of the Eastern countries share a lot of culture with regards to like how parents treat their children and vice versa. So I think there were things that I could relate to, and yet things that I found different and somewhat jarring. I was like, is that a thing? But yeah, I think that was a pretty enjoyable read when I read it. But yes, your wrap up, your talk, please.
No, I think it did a very good job with there because it's so short, and in some ways it should kind of be pithy in some ways. But you're right; it thematically has a lot of things that again make you think about how we treat our children, how we treat our parents, how society views us. Basically, it's the story of this woman, while never named that she is neurodivergent of any sort, can't do right for doing wrong her entire life. She takes things literally. She makes mistakes with social interactions with people. There's the story of when she's a young girl and there's a fight at school and people are screaming, "Come, somebody just get these two boys to stop fighting." And she goes and grabs a spade from the shovel and whacks one around the back of the head. Which effectively stops the fight. Absolutely dead, but all anybody said is turns around and says, "What is wrong with you?" And she's very confused because, I mean, is this not what everybody was asking for? And she goes to university and is on a successful path in life and seems to be doing well. And while she's studying, she starts working at a convenience store. And the convenience store is the one place that she finds there's a very set way that she has to behave, and she's been told to behave. So it says, when you're greeting customers, you say, "Good morning, how are you? How's your day been?" And she finds the rules of that are the first time in her life that people go, "Oh, you're doing really good. You're doing a really great job there." She fits into society there, even though she's literally following a script. But because she stays in that job and because she enjoys it, people are looking at her going, "What is wrong with you for not moving on?" Even though for the first time in her life, she feels solid and content in that. And everything else with the kind of relationships with males and other people are all tied up to the fact that she feels that society has this expectation of her, even though she's perfectly happy being a part-time worker in a convenience store and kind of having that feeling of knowing how the store works and kind of feeling like she belongs in society once, and yet she butts her head against everybody else's expectations. And it's sort of funny in some bits and kind of very sad in others. And in 150 pages, it's done. But you get a sense of, as Varsha quite rightly said, the culture, the familial kind of constraints, the sisters and everybody else that goes on her. And it's just such a fun read because I think everybody can sort of recognize what's happening this person and from the outside looking in, whereas she's just kind of caught up in the middle of it. And yeah, a wonderful book. It's one that I'd hardly recommend. And I'd be surprised if somebody didn't read it and get something out of it because it is sort of very upfront about what it is and what it's trying to say. What else do I have? I read Pet Sematary by Steve's favourite author, Stephen King.
He is my favorite.
He is your absolute favourite. People love Pet Sematary. I thought it was just okay. I have to be honest. I thought it was fine. It was nearly exactly, with the name Pet Sematary, I think it's exactly the book that you think it's going to be. I think everything that happens in it is what you think is going to happen with the name Pet Sematary. A lot of people say it's the scariest Stephen King book. I mean, it's creepy. I don't know if it's scary. And as usual, I think the ending cut out the last 30 pages. Not needed. But I think, I mean, everybody says that about King. I say it especially, but for the most part, not needed. But again, it's really propulsive read. I do like the worlds that he creates. It's often the side characters that's the most interesting character. I think that was my biggest problem, is that I didn't actually really love any of the characters. There were some people that were getting there and then just fell off. But yeah, I've got a discussion about that coming up later on in the month, I think, with the Lady Jane books. So,
oh wow!
So we'll get into that. This was a reread for her, first time read for me, so that'll be fun. What else did I have? We talked about Children of Time. Was fabulous. I really thought it was great, and as we were talking about in our most recent discussion about the next book, I just sort of wish it was a standalone in some ways. I don't feel like, not to say that I'm disliking the next book massively, I just feel like as a piece of fiction, it's stood pretty alone itself. A couple of really fun ones. I read a book called It Lasts Forever and Then It's Over by Andy Markin, which I knew nothing about. I started reading, and about 30 pages in, again, a very, very short book, I realised that it was a zombie telling about their life after death. Which is not, I don't know what I thought I was going to be reading. I thought it was going to be this lit fic book of some sort of contemporary fiction, but it's literally about a zombie kind of trying to make sense of their life and the connections that they had in their life while they were alive and what that means now and where they fit into the world now. It's totally bizarre, but it's almost told a bit like The Road in those little vignettes. So they go from place to place and they kind of experience their thoughts as they come to places that they've either seen before or they don't know, and thinking about the drive of what keeps you living. It's one of those books that I keep thinking back and going, it's such an odd little weird piece of fiction, again, really short, 130 pages, never outstays its welcome, has some things to say and ask, but really interesting. We read Swamp Thing Volume 1, Steve. Oh, and Varsha. Varsha was there as well, that's right. We were all in that together. Volume 1 of 6, which we'll be continuing on with. Very comic booky, I think, is the thing. You know, it feels like a serialized comic book insofar as it has its like four issue story arc, and then it moves on to the next story arc, etc. Which is maybe a bit of a change from the ones that we'd read together previously, like Kill or Be Killed or Getting Falls, which have like a whole sweeping 30 issue story arc going forward. I'm interested to see how it goes. He's an interesting character, that kind of combination of ecological disaster and humanity. So that was cool, and we'll be doing the second volume of that shortly. And then Last and First Men, which I didn't think was great. It was interesting, not great. Charlie Gold, which I did like. Pearl's Gate, which we'll be discussing tomorrow, the end of, which I'll say, spoiler, I thought was utterly fabulous. It's by far and away my favourite book in that series so far, by a long way. The events that happen in that book, the way that they pay off, and the events that happen towards the end, so exciting. I just absolutely loved that, and it's the longest book I think in the series, aside from maybe the last one, possibly. And yet, like, it's a long read, but I've seen a lot of talk about, it's been kind of a bit all over YouTube in the past couple of months about people talking about the prose within Johnny's writing. And I think when you get the kind of level of storytelling, the events especially that happen in this book, the prose with those events and the way you set up the characters make it another 50% better than any other book you've ever read in some ways. Like, I think people could say it can be slow to read, and that can be fair. But when it hits, it hits. It's so good. And then the other two that I read And I read a book called Happening by Annie Ernaux, which is a memoir of a young girl. It's actually the memoir of a Nobel Prize winning author of her life in early France, where she got pregnant while she was in university in France at a time in the 60s when abortion was outlawed, and nobody would even speak to her about it. And kind of about her attempts to have an abortion when people seen her as the death and dearth of society because she was a young girl who was pregnant, that kind of attitudes towards females, where the males could just kind of not get involved. Like, of all of the books that we've read, Child of God, Blood Meridian, it's the one that turned my stomach the most. Not in a, I don't want to be reading this, but more because you're kind of feeling for the person. And again, translated fiction of a personal memoir, I think it's a really weird thing because it's not actually the person's original words. You're reading them through somebody else. I think that's kind of weird and strange. But I hardly recommend that. Again, 80 pages or something is all that it is. And it's quite brilliant. And the last one I finished today was a book called Elena Knows, which is not translated fiction. It's an Argentinian book. And again, quite short, 150 pages. So the story tells the story of a mother over the course of a day who tries to make sense and try and find out who could have killed their daughter. Her daughter is found hanging from a belfry at a church. Everybody else thinks it's suicide, and she thinks it's definitely not because she has her reasons. She has her reasons of knowing her daughter and that kind of stuff. And it goes through her day. Now, what makes this interesting is the fact that the mother, Elena, suffers from Parkinson's, but not the form of Parkinson's that we'd recognize, which would be the shakes. She literally has lost control of her muscles and she needs medication to loosen it up. So she can't raise her head above a certain point. She can't walk properly. And when the medication wears off, she literally can't move or otherwise. So the whole book is structured around her taking up of her tablets. There are 4 sets of tablets that she takes during the day. And so you get these peaks and valleys. She sets out in the day on this journey. We don't know where to, what she's going to see, what cause is, and the people she's encountered along the way, and people's pity towards her having lost a daughter, pity towards her being essentially a medically sick person, and her want for people just to take her seriously and not just see her as a disabled cripple in a lot of ways. It's phenomenally powerful. I mean, the end of that book's another quite brilliant, but has that kind of mystery element to it, as well as what happened to the daughter. Well, who would have done that to her, all that kind of stuff. And yeah, really, really interesting book and really, really great. So very strange and wonderful reading month for me this month, but some really good books. A lot of emotional, heavy stuff though, which I've tried to rectify nearly immediately from what I've started to pick up this for reading next month.
Which one? Sorry, I missed that last part. What did you say you're going to pick up
So next, well, I've started this month. I have picked up, actually, somebody's made, I have holding this up opposite camera first, but this is A.R. Witham's new book, which is Crimes of Rooker Flynn. It arrived in the post today. It just came out earlier on the week.
Nice.
If anybody's read Legend of Blackjack, it's Rooker Flynn from Blackjack. Jack's in it as well. It's that same world. It's just so much fun. Oh God, I just think Andy's worlds are just an awful lot of fun, and it's a really great diversion from that kind of heavy stuff that I've been talking to. I just picked it up earlier on, and I'm 60 odd pages in today, and I was reading The Secret Life of Insects, which I was talking to you about last night, which is kind of these horror short stories that are just so weird. Steve would like them a lot. They're just these little percolating ideas of this stuff's really, really odd and strange, and they're all short enough. It's like the opposite. We had read Stories of Your Life and Others, which we were like, great ideas go on far too long. This is the opposite. These stories are so short, you just get the idea and he's out.
So bad ideas, very short stories.
No, great ideas, really short, really super short. So in some cases 5 pages, 6 pages, enough idea to go out. It's by Bernardo Esquinca. I think it's published in America by New Ruins Publication and Dead Ink Books in the UK. Again, I'm about 80 pages into that at the moment, and they're an awful lot of fun. You can just read a whole of the ones, those after each one after another, one after another. And horror short stories, they are cool.
So do you guys get, I realized recently that I can read horror without creeping myself out like the way I do with movies. But I still haven't read a lot of horror. So question for you both. Do you get like nightmares? Have you read any stories that haunt you way afterwards?
Chris, have you had any?
I don't think I've ever been scared reading a book. Like properly scared in the same way that I would, you get a jump scare in a film, but that's by design. That it's not almost a combination of your audio visual range being used against you. Certainly, like a lot of her books are thrilling. You get the adrenaline pump and excitement is happening, but never scared, just creeped out sometimes, but never to the point that I have with some video games or movies that I've kind of went, I'll need to press pause and stop because that's just a bit overwhelming in a lot of ways, the sensory kind of inputs that I'm getting. I have never got that, but then I wouldn't consider myself a very seasoned horror writer or reader, should I say. Maybe unlike Steve.
Yeah, I think the only book that really freaked me out was Negative Space by B.R. Yeager. That book gave me nightmares. But usually it doesn't really bother me too much. But yeah, that book. Yeah.
Very interesting.
The person that most people say to read is Eric LaRocca. That seems to be who a lot of people seem to talk about, who does a mixture of short stories and stuff, whatever. But I've read the synopsis and I'm just kind of going, like, it seems creepy. How could that be scary? I don't.
So I'll be honest. I read things have changed since, what was it? Things have changed since we last spoke, or I don't know, whatever the long title is. And at the climax, I laughed because it was so ridiculous. I thought it was hilarious, and not in a good way.
Yeah.
So there's that. But a lot of people it's a love or hate kind of book. So
yeah.
But yeah, I thought the end was pretty hilarious, unintentionally. But
horror's a strange genre. I'd say even in film, again, not to mention again, but films like Martyrs, etc. Once you've seen a lot of horror movies and seen that they're sort of fun, people sort of gravitate towards that very extreme version that was very famous in France during the 90s, 2000s, etc. That Martyrs, etc. came out, and it's sort of continued a little bit the thing, but it's almost very extreme filmmaking is what people are looking for, to get that same feeling of revulsion or scare that they would get in something else.
I've seen a lot of regular horror readers or movie watchers judge a horror movie or book based on how scared they got. Is that the only criteria you use for a horror book, or are there other things you normally get out of reading horror? Like, what makes you read horror, I guess, is a question. As someone who doesn't naturally gravitate towards that genre.
That is a good question.
It's kind of like people who love roller coasters. They try to find the roller coaster that will do something a little different or scare them in ways. And I don't like roller coasters. It's just the only example I can think of. Just that will do something a little different or have a certain, just to get your adrenaline pumping or challenge you in some ways. But there's not a whole lot. There are some great stories. I think you could do a lot with horror, but there's a lot of crap too, obviously, with any genre. But I think I gravitate more towards the grief side, and that's why that's kind of my thing, as you guys know. So,
I mean, I can only really, because I don't read a lot of horror, and most things that if somebody told me that it was horror, a lot of things I wouldn't recognize as horror. I would just see it as kind of thriller. I would say there's many a crime book that's more scary than a horror book because of the reality of it sometimes. But if I think of King, what I like about it's King's character writing is what makes him either people like him or hate him. I think it's very little to do with the horror, because the setup for his books are usually quite simple. You know, there's a simple idea or a simple construct that he runs out for 400 or 500, 600 pages at the end of the day, and you know, there'll be elements that are very recognizable as things you'll see in the movies. You know, so I think that's one of the reasons he's successful. But the reason I like reading him is that internal monologue of the characters, and sometimes the setup of small town America, you know, that he does very well. Those are the kind of things that I really like about his writing, that sort of make it very propulsive. And again, knowing how somebody moves about their town, how small it is, you know, it can create its own level of horror. A place that seems like nothing ever happens, but all of a sudden has become this sort of dangerous place because of something else that can't be explained, or some evil malevolence of some sort. And I think he probably plays in the idea of evil as a trope rather than grief or anything like that. You know, it's very much that there is a devil kind of character kind of exists in the world that can control people and events to a certain point. So I don't. It's hard to say, because like I can't remember ever being scared reading the book. And I thought that was one of the things I was sort of looking for with Pet Sematary, was that a lot of people said, "Oh, this is by far and away his most scary book." The one seems creepy, and I'm pretty sure it wasn't the scene that everybody else found creepy in its own right. I found Salem's Lot much more scary or thrilling, if you want, in that way. I think Salem's Lot was pretty great in that way, but you know, it's hard to know. It's hard to know about horror. It's not, maybe it's just not my central genre, and I can't speak about it in enough kind of authority.
I do think it's interesting though that a lot of the books we've been reading are not so fantasy heavy as it used to be.
Yeah.
I
think
interesting.
Yeah. I used to read exclusively like literary and contemporary fiction because I didn't know I don't know what hole I was living in. I didn't know of fantasy and sci-fi as like their own genres. Anything that seemed interesting to me, I would pick up. But I did at some point go to Wheel of Time, and then I followed from there for other books like it, and I ended up wholesale reading fantasy and sci-fi exclusively for a couple of years. But now I think I'm all glutted out on it, and now I want a mixture of both. I don't think I want to stop reading either one. So
yeah, I definitely feel that as well, Varsha. There's definitely a thing when you read too much of any one genre. Like if I went back 15, 20 years, it would have been a lot of crime. At a certain point, you can see the paint by numbers aspect of those books as well, and you kind of go, like, you start the book off, you see that the event that happens, and you kind of go, in some level, I see how this plays out, and at that point, I need to read something else. And I think that can be true of fantasy. I think fantasy's biggest problem in that regard is that a lot of the books tend to be very long. Every book that you, or series that you engage with, is either multiple books, and within those multiple books, there's at least one 600, 700 page chunker in the middle of that, and at a certain point, that becomes quite overbearing and I'd say unhealthy for having a healthy reading life. And that's one of the things that I find when you have your bits to go, where you were talking reading slumps or anything like that. If you're continually pounding yourself over the head with like books that you are struggling to get through and get some resolution with, that's sort of where, for me anyway, reading slumps kind of come from, insofar as you hit one of those books and you're like, oh, I'm not making any progress here whatsoever. Yeah. And it's one of the reasons we do our reading groups as well, because you've got that propulsion to keep you going. Right, here's 100 pages this week, here's 100 pages this week, and you always are moving forward. So even if you get this period or set of chapters that you're like, it's not doing it for me, you're going to be reading on the next week or so and doing something else. But yeah, I've sort of found myself kind of a bit not reading very much fantasy this year, been reading a lot more sci-fi. But again, I'm finding the same thing with some of the sci-fi as well. Maybe not in the Masterworks kind of sense, but a lot of modern sci-fi going, I can sort of see the space opera element of it kind of coming through that becomes a bit more predictable and kind of going, right, let's look at some other genres of books and kind of tipping around them to keep things fresh. And reading short books always helps. Like if I found out anything this year, the 150 page to 200 page book is king, because those books usually, not only just the fact they're short, but they usually have economy of idea. And they present the idea, they show it to you, and then they get out and leave it with you without kind of thinking about, I need to bulk this out so that people think they're getting value for money. And I don't think I worry so much about value for money as so much as give me an interesting story or give me an interesting premise or an idea to explore. And I'll be satisfied with that, regardless of the length.
Yeah. I think with fantasy stories, or at least books in general, like stories that are told across multiple books, which typically fantasy stories tend to be, it takes a lot of patience. And I think each book needs to be interesting in and of itself, but also whatever it is you're building towards, whatever you're waiting for, I think it takes a lot of patience, which, as some of you know, I lack sometimes. But yeah, I see your point. It's easy. Like I've sometimes I crave a book that I can start and finish in the same day or in a couple of days, and usually when that happens, like it's a romance book that I can finish in a few hours that I tend to pick up because, or some contemporary literature. But yeah, like there need to be books for when I want to devour something, when I want to spend a lot of time on something, like just thinking about it, and like for all kinds of moods, right? So reading multiple books at a time helps, but also means like I have fewer instances of, oh, I can just read this in one sitting.
Not all fantasy books have to be 600 pages.
Yeah. There's one of my favorites, like The Forgotten Beast of Eld. It's, I think, 200 and change, and it's absolutely brilliant. And it can measure legs with any fantasy book in its depth of themes and what it's exploring with the story of this one person. And it's beautifully written. Fantasy books don't have to be long. In fact, I think there's a parallel series of books like the SF Masterworks. There's a fantasy Masterworks, which only has a few, not as many as the sci-fi Masterworks, but those are all pretty short. They're less than 300 pages, and I think those are considered Masterworks, so that has to say something.
Yeah. Not to be devil's advocate too much here, right? The argument has always been that for fantasy books that you have to set the world and build the world, and that takes a lot of pages. But pretty much 90% of fantasy books are some representation of medieval England, right?
Yeah.
You don't need 600 pages if it's going to be medieval England. Like I sort of get it, and maybe a bigger problem is the cast of characters being large, and that you setting up the multiple POVs, etc. But you can have stuff happen and be done with it in short. And I actually think, I don't want to get off topic too much here, but I think you see the direction of, like, a lot of people in self-pub or fantasy or otherwise all feeling like they have to produce these 400 to 600 page books. I think the direction of travel, is going to be towards the short novella and creating stories within a short stories within a world. You've seen how successful some authors have been in forging a career in sci-fi and fantasy and genre fiction by starting off by just writing very short fiction. You know, a Becky Chambers, a Martha Wells, Nevo, they all kind of, Nevo especially, talked about the fact that somebody just asked her, she was trying to get published for years, couldn't do it, and somebody says, could you write 150? There's a gap in the market with nothing coming out in the next 3 months. Could you write something in that? And she went, yeah. She's now writing 5 or 6 books in that series, while also trying to propel a novel career out of that. And those novellas sell for a good chunk of change as well. There's as much money in a short novella that's written well as the big, more 150,000 word book series. And I think we'd see more of a push towards that kind of shorter story. Because a lot of people talked about the rise of cozy fantasy with the likes of Legends and that type, but cozy fantasy has been where the novella has been for a long while, with the likes of Sam of the Wild Built and stuff by wasn't that by Becky Chambers? It was, yeah. And where she found which is often been cozy fantasy where that has lived. So, I think the days of the 600-page 6-book series. What's wrong with a standalone? I love a standalone. A good standalone. You write something else afterwards. I definitely think there's a beauty to that.
Yeah. And we've seen in a lot of the short stories that we've read that there's a lot that you can do with just suggestion. You don't have to lay out every tiny detail. Like, I do think that the fantasy books that are bigger are because they have a large cast of characters and everybody needs screen time. But if it's not that, if it's the world building where we're spending the time, I think the short story collection that you mentioned, Chris, the Codwainer Smith one, we don't have, none of them actually laid out the details of the world, but we can build across all of them a pretty good picture of what the world looked like. And same with a lot of the short stories we've been reading in the Speculative Speculations podcast. Like, there's just suggestions of worlds that look a certain way, or even the SF Masterworks. Most of the ones we've read are less than 300 pages long, but they are elaborate, complex worlds that the stories are set in. Murderbot, multiple planet, solar system spanning world, but every book is 150 to 200 pages long. So, yeah, it can be done.
And I think for genre readers, by and large, I think you can assume are people that are reasonably intelligent. I think that's one of the things that I think we find when reading a lot of our stories is that the most successful books are the ones that respect the reader to kind of fill in the blanks themselves and kind of say, I don't need to lay this all out for you. You know, this is the important stuff. And you might have a slightly different picture in your head from the person next to you, but ultimately the themes and ideas and philosophies that we'll have here are the things that I really want to talk about. And, you know, I think that as an idea could propel us into another kind of very healthy period of fantasy literature, genre literature in general.
Yeah.
I haven't said that. Not to say it's.
I would like to. Sorry.
Not to say it's unhealthy necessarily at the moment, because we have such a breadth of stories between self-pub and the lesser traditional pub, because there's just less of that stuff coming out. But it's just so much and it's hard to find at the moment. It's and if everything's 600 pages, how do you invest that time in to kind of find that book, especially if it's 600 pages times 3?
Yeah.
Sorry, Varsha.
And unless you're Brandon Sanderson or Adrian Tchaikovsky, it's like, even from a writing point of view, I think there's only so many 600-page books you can churn out in a lifetime versus many novellas, maybe. I don't know. I guess to each their own. I was going to say, I think science fiction is considered the genre of like thought experiments and ideas. I feel like fantasy has potential to be that too, like a completely different world where you're exploring ideas, which I think a lot of fantasy tends to do, but I don't know if it's, I think there can be a lot more done with that, like what Jemison did with the Broken Earth trilogy, for instance. Yeah,
right, a great example.
Write novellas, fantasy authors.
But I think in general, good advice for somebody starting off would be write your story in 2 forms. It means you can pitch it twice. You know, if you're going to spend the time creating a world and you're going to write the longer form novel, think of what a shorter version of that in that world would be. And because I definitely see a hunger for more of those novellas on shelves. Like I definitely see people kind of going, there's not enough of those. You see the clamour for hardback copies of Murderbot, the Sam Wilde build, the Sean Maguire series. You know, all of those ones are reasonably successful. And even like I think of somebody like P. Jelly Clark, who writes some novels as well. But P. Jelly Clark's Ring Shout is one of the most magnificent pieces of writing, Ring Shout, that I have read in the past couple of years. And it's a very short novella. I think it's absolutely magnificent piece of fantasy, historical writing. And how wonderful if you have a great literary mind to get more books more often with ideas, and that's really what you want from people, rather than necessarily, like, everybody loves a good series they can get their teeth into. Like, we all kind of sit here as children of those series that we love. Like, you've been talking about Second Apocalypse series, etc., being 6 books long, and the kind of where that story meanders and moves. But getting those ideas from really great literary minds is, yeah, lots of those. What did you read, Steve?
My list is a lot shorter than your list. Your lists are, unsurprisingly, a lot of the books that I read are the same ones you did too.
Yay!
So, Children of Time. It's a great science fiction. Really flies. Really easy read with some really great ideas. It reminded me a lot of the early books in the Expanse series, where it explores a lot of great ideas, but it does it in a subtle way. Again, you can read it surface level and enjoy it, but you can also dive into the themes and some of the other ideas that it explores. I really appreciate that. It reads really quickly, and great start to the series. I can see why it's so beloved. Started Children of Ruin. We'll get into that on the Speculative Speculations podcast. Go check that out. Child of God. This is our third McCarthy book in about 3 months.
Yeah,
it was. I connected with it probably the least, less than I did the other ones. But after our discussion, as usual, kind of have a different thought on it. And I think McCarthy really. I wonder how much McCarthy wanted us to explore those ideas and kind of face our own stereotypes that we have, the ideas we have of certain people, of ourselves, of kind of what we expect from certain people, from certain parts of the country of America. I think he's almost like shining a mirror on ourselves and what we expect, our expectations of certain people are. So I think it's kind of bent my mind a little bit after our conversation. Made me think about it differently. But yeah, I think McCarthy's it can be very challenging, but in a good way, because it challenges you to face your own kind of expectations in a way. I don't know if I'm giving him too much credit, but he's McCarthy and I'm just a guy on a podcast. So what do I know? Also finished The White Luck Warrior. It's probably my least favorite book in the Second Apocalypse series, but we're on to The Great Ordeal. The last 2 books are something else. So I'm looking forward to that.
So least favorite across all 7?
My least favorite, yeah.
Interesting. That makes me really excited for The Great Ordeal. And I already am. We're 3 chapters in, and I think it might be my favorite book so far already, but yeah, Steve's nodding mysteriously.
Yeah, so. I think we'll re-explore how dark you think the second part is after the last 2 books, because
okay.
Yeah, but I think it's dark in more of a horror way, and we've already talked about that, about kind of more horror elements and things that happen, especially in the second book, or especially The Judging Eye. There's a lot of dark things that happen in that one. So it's something else for sure.
There was one deeply disturbing image. Speaking of horror and things that give you the creeps for days afterwards, there was one scene, Chris, in The Judging Eye that anyone mentions it still makes me creep out. Go ahead,
Oh,
Steve.
no, it's okay. It's, pretty creepy. And of course, Swamp Thing Volume 1. I'm a big Alan Moore fan. Yeah. He's one of my favorite authors, but I think just reading, kind of going back to the beginning of his career and seeing kind of a snapshot of that time period and kind of where he started, and you can see the beginnings of other things that he's done with Swamp Thing Volume 1, and it's really not even about Swamp Thing. It is about the surrounding, and I don't think Swamp Thing's really that compelling of a character or that intriguing of a character, but the way that he incorporates him in the world and how he integrates him with other people and other ideas, so far it's been really enjoyable. So I think that's all the things I've read this month. And of course, we're reading the big books of science fiction, chipping away at that. But yeah, I think that's it for me. You guys read a lot more than I do.
So it is safe to say that I control Steve's entire reading list.
That is for sure. Yeah.
I'm feeling a certain power.
Yeah, I think so.
What's next for Steve, Varsha? What's he got to look forward to next that he doesn't know about?
Let's see. The Great Ordeal, 1984. Yeah. That one was all Steve, by the way. I'm not taking credit for Child of God in 1984. I was
going to say Child of God was Steve's pick.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. the wheel of doom. What should we call it? That sounds horrible, like we're reading uninteresting books. But the wheel of, I don't know, we'll think of a name. But Steve won the wheel twice in a row. So Child of God and 1984 are Steve's picks. But I'm looking forward to 1984. I read it a long time ago, and I think I read books slightly differently then. It was a lot of read to find out what happens versus read to see what I can. I mean, I think I did both, if I'm being honest. But the find out what happens always took over. So it'll be nice to go revisit this, especially in the context of like how I feel about the current political situation in a few different countries. But The Great Ordeal, 1984, Children of Ruin, and if based on how that goes, if we continue on with Children of Memory, that's it. All right?
I think so. And of course, Malazin's coming up too.
Malazin's coming up. I'm so excited for that. and Chris is joining us. He's agreed to it. That's
wow. Cool.
Chris has agreed to this.
Again,
yes, he has.
I like it. The evil overlord has spoken and has spoken for me in that regard. I mean, I'm in broad agreement, yes, indeed. But it's funny how this works out.
the evil overlord. So for all those of you at the beginning of the podcast who were thinking, oh, but Varsha is such a sweet girl, how can they possibly call her the evil overlord? This is why. Yeah. Nobody's thinking I'm a sweet girl.
No, this is the trick though, because even I still think it, and yet all the evidence as I'm like one of those people that said, no, but don't you look at those films and go, how did the people end up in that cult? Like, how could they not see that person through there? I find myself right in the middle of them. Yeah.
Yes, this is cult, evil overlord, cult overlord. Yeah. Nice. I'm racking up the nicknames, guys. Also known as the disruptor on the forum.
The blackjack queen. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I used to look queen if you lose all the time. Yeah.
Varsha the penniless.
Most of my money, most of my points are in the bank now.
Oh dear. Yeah.
I had an interesting question for you guys.
Well, the question I had while you're thinking of it was, what were the other options apart from 1984? Not that I'm begrudging 1984 because I actually owned it and I could, not have to buy another book and obviously there's some plan.
So I couldn't remember. I knew you wanted to replace American Psycho, but I couldn't remember with which one. I think I remember now, but I don't remember the name still. But it was a book with a green cover on it. So I kept American Psycho on the wheel. Jared still wanted Midnight Children on the wheel. I had Passenger before that. Yeah, but I took it out because I didn't want to do one more Cormac McCarthy book. What did I put on it instead? I think I did House of Spirits.
Oh, right, okay.
By Isabella Allende.
Yeah.
I think that's the one I
That's interesting.
did. Or no, or maybe I did Ghost Written. Yeah, I think I did Ghost Written by David Mitchell. So I'm on a mission to read his books in publication order now, and Ghost Written was his first book. Yeah. But maybe I shouldn't start with the first published book by an author to do a group read. I'm probably going to take that off, and I might put House of the Spirits on there.
It's interesting because I did go and pick up another. I picked up All the Pretty Horses at the bookshop yesterday because I was like, "Oh, I'm McCarthy-less. I've read 3 books of his this year, and I should have another one on the shelf just in case."
Do you already own Passenger?
No.
That's the one I want to. Well, okay, that's the McCarthy book I'm leading up to. I have heard very interesting things about it.
It's so unusual for me to be up to date with my reading of any kind of type of book that, I should probably go and buy another 2 McCarthy books so he just looks like every other author myself now,
Is All the Pretty Horses... he wrote one trilogy, right?
Yeah,
is All the Pretty Horses the beginning of that, or is it a standalone?
Border Trilogy.
Jeez.
Yeah, it's the Border Trilogy by Cormac McCarthy, isn't it? Let's see. Those books are... See how well prepared we are.
No Country
All the Pretty Horses, The Crossing, and Cities of the Plain. There you go. 92, 94, 98.
Cool. Chris is secretly trying to get us to read an entire trilogy.
Do that. It would be a challenge, though.
Yes, yeah. I just sort of want to have it just in case. Like, you want to give yourself options, isn't that the idea?
Yeah. I like what? Yeah, I do want to read all of McCarthy eventually, but this is one of those. There are some authors that I just want to plow my way through in publication order. I've started that with Jane Austen. I read Sense and Sensibility last month. I enjoyed it immensely. And I'm going to start with Charles Dickens audiobooks.
What one are you starting with?
The first one, the Pickwick Papers. Yeah.
I failed at that many years ago.
And what else? Who else? Yeah, I think David Mitchell I want to start with Ghost Written.
There's too many books.
Cormac McCarthy is too late to do publication order now. So
you ruined it.
All the books.
So, but I could do reverse publication order if I start from Passenger and work my way backwards.
But then you'd be doing the Border Trilogy in reverse order. That wouldn't work.
Oh, trilogies we have to do in order. Or like series. Because Passenger was published before Stella Maris, so it wouldn't work that way. So anyway, it's stupid. I'll do them in whatever order.
Yeah, that's a good books for the month of July.
Yeah, good stuff.
Yeah, what else have you got coming up, Chris?
I'm due another Discworld novel, so I'm on Sorcery at the moment. I believe, yeah.
Ooh. Have I read Sorcery yet? I haven't reread it yet.
It's one of those. I've got that. What else do I want to read? I want to read a fantasy book of some sort this month. I haven't decided which one it's going to be. Possibly, I've been 2 years since I read a Robin Hood book, so I might go for a Royal Assassin book too. Might go for that.
Nice.
But we'll see how it goes. Shall I just look at the wall and go, what'll I go for?
Nice.
Yeah, that's nice to do. I just realized we have a whole month almost of no discussions any weekend. Like not counting the speculative speculations and Second Apocalypse. We have nothing on
apart from all
Saturdays
of the ones we've
Sundays.
already planned. We have nothing planned.
This is like that leaves my weekends vastly open. I can read whatever I want.
We can fix that pretty quick.
Yeah. If anybody has been listening long, has any requests,
yeah,
start a thread on the page, June. Paramita will probably have his rolled into one. Although I did, if Paramita is listening, I did have Solenoid in my hand the other day and nearly picked it up. That is an interesting looking book.
What won that poll?
It was split the last time I seen now, I have to say.
Interesting.
I don't know what actually did win.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A good month.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Was a good month.
It was a good month.
Solenoid won. Yeah. I could definitely go for Solenoid.
Too many options.
It's a big book though. It's one of those chunky ones.
By one vote. Who was the second vote? Chris and Paramita voted for Solenoid. Suzanne, I've read 2666. I don't remember anything about it. I might read it again.
That's a good recommendation.
I read it 10 years ago. I don't tend to remember books, but I think... Did I have my Goodreads account at the time? I may have rated it 5 stars. Let's see. Sometimes, 5 stars. All I remember about books is that I liked them very much. And that's
enough sometimes.
Oh, you know what I'm going to put next month? Not House of Spirits. I'm going to do Life After Life.
That's good. I mean, anybody listening along will get a window into Varsha's mind there. We have been talking for 10 minutes and she's already changed her mind 4 times.
Yeah, that's true.
More evidence of evil overlordness.
Yeah.
But thank you both for hanging out. Of course, it's always fun to hang out.
Very cool. Yeah, indeed. Was.
Yes. I enjoyed the wrap-ups. I'm too lazy to film my own, so thank you for hosting these three.
Yeah.
Well, in the meantime, Chris, where can people find you?
You can find me on the Speculative Speculations podcast with your 2 bad selves and Jared and Dan. You can find me on my own channel at the Chronicle of Chris, or you can find me in the PageTune forums.
Yes, and Varsha.
You can find me on the YouTube channel Reading by the Rainy Mountain, on the podcast that Chris just mentioned, Speculative Speculations, and haunting the PageTune forums all the time.
Yes, you can find me on PageTune or on Speculative Speculations. All the links are down below in the description. Go check them out. And if you have any suggestions for us, what we can read, or give Varsha more ideas, change our mind again, let us know in the forum or in the comments. So hope everyone has a fantastic July. Stay safe, and we'll talk to everyone very soon.